Okay. So, good evening to all who are joining us, wherever you are, whether you are on Zoom or whether you're joining via one of the social media channels that we're streaming to. It's lovely to have you with us for this evening's talk and discussion. And it's my delight and privilege as the rabbi of the community to introduce Jörg, who is going to be speaking to us, who is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Essex and who also directs the education part of and I love this pairing, and maybe another time, Jörg, we can talk about it, the School of Philosophy and Art History. And I know that Jörg's own background includes philosophy and aesthetics and theory of art and media, and he's also had a spell, so this was in Germany, he's also had a spell in North Carolina, studying philosophy, comparative literature and anthropology, and having got his PhD in Germany with some additional studies in Cambridge, he is very much leading on aesthetics, critical theory, German philosophy, social and political philosophy, medical ethics, which means that he's probably got too many words that he could use that would leave me floundering. But I know that Jörg has been focusing on making sure that what he's presenting to us this evening will be in chunks and in language that we can all follow, because he's addressing a topic that I think is pertinent and important, which is at the core of, if you like, who we are. And are we who we think we are? And have we become us, or are we in the process of becoming us? And so, without further ado, I'm going to invite Jörg to speak to us all. What we've agreed is that Jörg will speak in short sections of about 3 sections of his talk, with an opportunity for questions at the end of each of those sections. So we'll be aiming to keep each section within if you like, a time window of 18 to 20 minutes or so that at the end of the 3rd section, we can take any overall questions as well and still not overrun on the overall time of the session. So with great pleasure, Jörg, I'd like to hand over to you and we'll spotlight you now.
Thank you so much, Richard. Maybe one little point, so that the first section is a bit longer than the other ones. So the first section is going to be around 15 minutes, and then the other one's going to be shorter than that. Symmetry is something we all aim for but never achieve. So I don't know. I wanted to start with saying basically thank you for inviting me. I also want to basically say thank you for all the hospitality I've experienced at ELELS for the last year, and sort of for the opportunity to learn more about Judaism and getting a sense of how it's practiced in liberal Judaism these days. And I know this is not something you can take for granted, but I'm really, really grateful for this. Since sort of I had a chance to get to know you, I thought I'd give you a chance to get to know what I'm thinking about these days. I'm in the process of writing a book, and I'm not attempting to tell you what this book is about, and I think that's better for all of us. But so what I'm going to be presenting is sort of related to what I'm doing in this book, and I hope it is sufficiently interesting for everyone. So I basically just start now with my first section. So the title of my talk entails this idea of self-becoming. And that points to a particular way of thinking freedom. And sort of there are basically with everything in philosophy, there's different ways to conceptualize everything. Yeah. So there are different ways of conceptualizing freedom. A classic British tradition with Hobbes is sort of as negative freedom, you're free whenever there's no obstacle. Yeah. So nothing external that keeps you from doing something you're otherwise capable of doing. The notion of self-becoming is linked to the notion of self-realization, and that's a distinct tradition in philosophy about thinking freedom. And that's associated with a thinker that is very important for me. That's sort of Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, an important German philosopher from the 19th century. And their freedom is thought along the lines of self-realization. And because human beings are very multidimensional beings, self-realization is a multidimensional phenomenon. Yeah. So there are aspects of self-realization that really, where it shouldn't really matter who it is. Yeah. For instance, when we realize ourselves as a moral subject or as a moral person, yeah, the question is really, what is the right thing to do for everyone in that position? Yeah. So when I'm thinking about, let's give you an example. I promised examples, so you're gonna get hopefully a lot of examples. If they elucidate the thing or not is sort of another story, but sort of give you examples. So let's think about Angela Merkel in 2015 and the Syrian refugee crisis. Yeah. So there's the question, sort of, should Germany be opening its borders, or should it sort of shut it down like other countries have done? Yeah. And in a way, when we ask whether Angela Merkel realizes herself as a moral being in that kind of situation, we are not asking a question about Angela Merkel. Yeah. We are basically asking, what is the right thing to do for someone in her position in that kind of situation? So what I'm interested in today, yeah, is a particular dimension of self-realization that concerns us as unique individuals. Yeah, so there's the question of sort of what does it mean and what is involved in realizing ourselves as individuals, as beings that are different from all other beings, and what is involved in cultivating our individuality. So that's the kind of question I want to ask. And always when you sort of think about matters of freedom, it's always telling sort of what the opposite looks like. Yeah. Sort of, if you think about negative liberty, yeah, I'm negatively free when there's no door in the way that is locked that keeps me from leaving that room, which I would be able to do were the door not locked. Yeah. So an external obstacle is, in the negative liberty tradition, the kind of thing that undermines my freedom. So what undermines my freedom when I think about freedom along the lines of individual self-realization? And there are cases which I come to in the end about oppression, yeah, that also affects, basically, we can be oppressed as individuals, like we can be oppressed as moral beings or as legal persons, and so on and so forth. But if we abstract from the case of oppression for the moment, what the opposite of individual self-realization is a kind of conventionalism. Hegel, for instance, speaks about the death of the individual, when you that arises from you just following custom. Yeah, if you just do what is expected from you to do in all kinds of situations, and you never sort of assert yourself in this, sort of, you never ask yourself, so what is it I feel about that? What is it? How do I perceive the situation, and so on and so forth? Then basically, if you just do what is expected from you, and you never really consult or engage yourself in this, that is the opposite of the kind of individual self-realization or freedom that I'm after. But that sort of raises the question of what does it take, basically, to realize yourself, as opposed to just playing a role in the way that nobody will take issue with. And what I want to argue today is that to cultivate your individuality and sort of to realize yourself as an individual, there are three capacities that are crucial for that. So in the case of moral freedom, the capacity that is crucial is that you can deliberate about what the right thing is and that you have the capacity to take responsibility for your action. In relation to self-realization as an individual, the capacities that are crucial are sense perception, so that we are sensing beings, emotions, and what is in some philosophical traditions called the play of faculties. And I will say more about that, or imagination, or whatever you want to call it. So I want to begin this talk now by giving you illustrations of what I mean when I say only when we explore these faculties or these capacities can we be ourselves or become ourselves or continue to become ourselves. And I want to start with sense perception. So what do I mean that sense perception plays a key role, or exploring the world with your senses plays a key role in self-realization? And I want to start with a relationship we're all familiar with: friendships. Yeah, if you have a friend, you take an interest in another person, not just as another fellow human being, but you take an interest in that person as an individual. Yeah, you insult your friend when you basically say, it doesn't matter who it is, but someone is my friend. You know, like there are relationships that turn on individuality, and friendship is one of those. And because that very relationship turns on individuality, what it means to be a good friend sort of points to another thing I'm interested in. What is it to encourage others to become the individuals they are? So what kind of attitudes towards others do we have to display? And sort of, again, like there's a lot of examples, and some are probably less interesting or smart than the others, but sort of one of the things you do as a friend, yeah, is you take an interest in the particular way someone else perceives the world. And we sort of have conversations with them and ask them sort of, what is it you're drawn to? Yeah, what is it sort of? And then they say, I don't know, I really recently discovered that literature is really important to me, or that I really enjoy baking. Yeah, whatever it is, sort of something captures their attention. Yeah, and if you as a friend don't pay attention to that, you're in a way not fulfilling your role as a friend, because that role is geared towards the individuality of the other, and the individuality sort of the other is flourishing or nourished by their particular way in which their unique perspective on things they contemplate, or that they are drawn to. So maybe you end up sort of then having conversations with them about what is it they find noticeable about a novel, yeah, or you talk to them about the different senses of textures in breads, because this is something they sort of apply their attention to in these times. And I think we all have become like that, sort of as bake-off watchers in this country. Yeah, so we all now pay attention and take an interest in the different textures of bread. And so that's just an example of what it means to relate to someone as an individual. You can only do that if you basically take seriously and encourage others to take seriously how they perceive the world around them. I want to sort of suggest an example that sort of in this context could be called to be closer at home. Yeah. So let's assume you are a member of a liberal Jewish community. Yeah. If I say that, yeah, about you, I say something very important about you. Yeah. But I say something about you that doesn't distinguish you from any other member of that community. So sort of that makes you sort of think about the other side of this. Yeah. That each liberal Jew is an individual, and sort of they have their unique relationship to Judaism. And sort of that raises the question of sort of, do I take an interest in them as the particular Jewish person they want to be, they are, and so on and so forth. And you could even argue that, I don't know, Richard can correct me later on this, that particularly the liberal strand in Judaism is one that sort of makes room for and explicitly encourage the cultivation of individuality in relationship to your Judaism. And that could be almost be thought of as a distinctive feature of this strand of Judaism. But maybe that pushes it too far. And maybe people will not like that I say that makes it an aesthetic form of Judaism in my books, but that's a completely different story. Anyways, so then again, sort of as a community, the question then is what does it take to cultivate the individuality of the liberal Jews in your community? And sort of one aspect that I think is important with regards to that is that sort of if you want to take care of your individuality as a practicing liberal Jew, you have to be mindful of how it is, how you perceive and how you sense practicing Judaism, so that you're alert with your senses in doing so, that it's not just a ritualistic. And that's again sort of the Hegelian worry that everything can become a custom, and sort of the only weapon against that is that you're mindful to how it is for you to say today, this prayer today or this year rather than last year, and so on and so forth, that you're continuously mindful of these kinds of things. And interestingly, there are sort of also basically practices inbuilt into Judaism that cultivate this kind of attentiveness that discloses individuality. So so I was thinking about that. For instance, one of the ways is sort of if there's a Shabbat morning service and we read a Torah portion, and then we have these breakout groups or discuss it together. What that is sort of a practice that invites you to be attentive to what it is you notice about the week's Torah portion, or about the Haftarah, or about the link between them. So and what's always fascinating in a way is that you notice that other people notice other things, and the people who notice the same thing as you will never see it exactly the way you do. So what that is, sort of that inbuilt in the practice of Judaism, is sort of an exercise of communal disclosure and sharing of individuality. And I think that's an important aspect of it. So in a way, I say more about that. Sorry, scrap that. I say more about that later. So the first lesson basically I wanted to share is sort of self-becoming is connected with remaining open to and being willing to let oneself be impressed by things we encounter, or with being attentive to what we encounter and how we perceive it, what we encounter. So it's basically there's a work on our perception. So we turn on our own perception in a way, and you're attentive to how it is. How do I actually see that? How do I perceive that? And sort of that's a self-centered moment. But there's also the other in relation to others. Do I comport myself in relation to others such that they feel encouraged to take seriously how they perceive something, to be attentive to how they perceive? And is my comportment towards other one in which they feel encouraged to share? Because in a way, what's distinct about humans is sort of how I perceive something is a very obscure kind of thing. And when I start to sort of explain it to people, it takes shape. Sort of in a way, we generate it in a dialogical fashion often. So because a lot of things are fairly obscure for us. And sort of in the act of expressing them, that we explore them further and they become clearer. So that brings me to the second capacity, which I think is essential for self-becoming in the sense I'm interested in it. And that's sort of, it's not just how you perceive something, but how you emotionally respond to it, or how you qualitatively experience something. So that there's in a way two ways in your attention turns backwards to you. So you see something and you ask yourself, what is it, or how do I actually see that? Or what is there to see? So there's this doubling always, and you have the same thing. Sort of we respond to all kinds of things emotionally, but we can also explore then what it means explore that. Sort of, let me give you another example. And I sort of started with this friendship example on the one hand and the Judaism examples on the other. So I just ended up running with this for the first part of the talk. So let's say your friend comes to you, and she says she has a sense that her feelings for her partner are undergoing a change or a transformation. And so as a friend, that sort of raises your alarm bells. Yeah. So you don't want to dismiss it. You don't want to ignore it. It's like, if you're a friend, something important is going on in how someone else experiences a very important part of how they're in the world. Yeah. If it's an important relationship. And so what that conversation then turns into is sort of, you explore that emotion. Yeah. You ask yourself sort of, when did you start noticing it? What triggers it? Has that feeling remained the same or is different? How would you express this feeling, and so on and so forth? You basically, you're not just having a raw emotion, but sort of if you relate to it in a way that discloses your individuality, you sort of really try to sort of work on this emotion and sort of to give it sort of to disclose as much about it as you can in a way. And for this sort of, and there's a reason we do that with friends often. And it requires sometimes this encouragement, because it's scary to do that sometimes on your own, or you don't like it. So there's all kinds of ways in which others play an important role here. So let me give you sort of, at this point, I was always thinking, is there an element in Jewish practice that entails this sort of reflecting on qualitative experiences or emotions. And obviously there are probably thousands of examples, but the thing that came to my mind is sort of the entire months of Elul, yeah, leading up to the Yamim Noarim, is sort of dedicated to reflection and introspection, yeah, and work on your soul. So it's an essential part, and sort of the beautiful thing about Judaism is sort of it has a time for everything. Sort of you never forget anything, because sort of there's a time when even if you forget, you're reminded of it, yeah, and so there's this moment sort of work on sort of seeing, relating to yourself, yeah, and so what you have qualitatively experienced, what you have done, and how you have experienced what you have done. So it could even be sort of why you're not, like, if you have a sense you wronged someone, but why is it that I'm not feeling guilty? Why is it that I'm not willing to really repent? Yeah, so there are all these kinds of questions that are exactly the kind of questions you need to give a true account of yourself, or become familiar with yourself. Yeah, it's these questions about your own emotions, the questioning of your own emotions, which you're invited to do in this sort of heshbon hanefesh, sort of the accounting of your soul. So that's exactly that's the kind of reflective practice on your emotions that I had in mind. That is crucial for self-becoming. Yeah, so that's lesson 2. In short, yeah. So that self-becoming is connected with exploring your emotional responses to aspects of your life. And with regards to others, it basically involves the question, do my practices or do my comportment towards others encourage other people to sort of be attentive to how they qualitatively or emotionally experience something? And can they encounter me as someone who's willing to engage in that kind of work with them if they feel the need to, or if they need someone to do this. That brings me sort of to the third part, and then I'm at the end of part 1. Is that it's what I call the play of faculties, yeah, or you could call it imagination. And this is sort of self-becoming where we sort of transform ourselves in the light of the work we have done. Sort of there's this moment of basically you're attentive to how you perceive the world or aspects of the world, and you're attentive and have explored how it is that you qualitatively experience it. And then from there, basically, your imagination is guided and generates ideas of what things could be different. Yeah, in the relationship, in the example I gave of friendship, again, sort of your friend might as part of this reflections, they might have ideas about how the relationship to their partner could change, how it could be transformed. There might be different versions of that, different ways in which that could change. And that is sort of very tricky because sort of all kinds of relationships, like to a degree, we like others to be reliable. Yeah. And whenever you change, others have to change too, because things no longer work as seamlessly as before, because when you change, interactions change, and so the other people have to adopt. So that's a very problematic thing in many ways. Yeah, but the point is, like, in a way, good transformation, if I want to call it like that, or good reimagination of relationships is grounded in this work of being attentive to your perceptions and being attentive to your emotions, and see what ideas for change emerge from that, rather than sort of have sort of feel resentment, never explore it, and then sort of stop. I don't know, being really harsh with someone. Yeah, so it's not much good will probably come out of that. And sort of that can also be sort of to bring it back to my other example, to this Jewish community example I've been using, sort of in a way that also happens, sort of, you could say, at the end of Elul, yeah, when we all come with our thoughts of what it would mean for us to be better versions of ourselves. And that sort of, these kinds of ideas, you could even have a sort of communal coming together after this, and sort of where we share sort of how we feel transformed and how we think our community would benefit from being transformed. So the third lesson is basically that self-becoming, and that's sort of the tricky, sort of the dangerous part in a way, where that makes us uncomfortable, because we know what we have, but we don't know what we get, in a way, whenever self-transformation is involved, sort of. But in a way, self-becoming is truncated or repressed, or in a way stinted, if it is not connected with allowing yourself and others to play with or reimagine aspects of a shared world, in the light of how they sort of perceive it and how they emotionally experience it. So that basically brings my first part to the close, where I just wanted to say, self-realization in human beings is a very complex thing, and I could have talked about many different dimensions of it, but the particular dimension of self-realization I'm interested in is how you become yourself as that individual you are. And that there are three things that are important for this. Being attentive to how you perceive or how you sense, being attentive to your emotional responses to all kinds of aspects of your life, and to allow yourself and others to reimagine the world on that basis. Good, I stop here now.
So you've taken us into these three areas, and can I invite any questions thus far? Ben, you've raised a hand, so let's come to you.
Thank you. Also, going just ahead of Peter. So I guess my question is this a good thing, becoming more yourself? Because you talked a bit, particularly in your last section, about it sounded like you were talking about making the world a better place. You never quite said that, but I wasn't quite following how it happens, because it seems everything's from your perspective. It's not about other people better. It's kind of what you perceive, and trying to make them kind of becoming more kind of introspective, if you like, and you reflect on what you like and become more like what you want. And you talked about sort of like being attentive to your friends and making your friends happy. And you talked about Yom Kippur and being introspective there, but none of it seems to be about, is this objectively good for the world? It's all about, is this good for me? Or is this authentic to me?
I think that's an excellent question, Ben. Thank you. Sort of later on so I want to say two things about that. Yeah. So the first, three things, if I were. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Yeah. But in a way, it tells me that you're on the ball, because you're raising a question that I felt I needed to raise later on. But sort of the first thing the second thing then to note is that, as I indicated, sort of self-realization for human beings is a complex kind of thing. Yeah. So there are different dimensions to it. Sort of you cannot just run with your self-realization as an individual, because you're also a moral being. So there's a way in which these so that the ideal would be that you realize yourself in all dimensions and they are in a form of harmonious whole. And whether that is possible or not is basically the big question since the 18th century. The first person who systematically raised this question was Friedrich Schiller in his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. And sort of, I was reminded about this question I sort of remember the line from the morning prayers from Bimidbar 1539, where it says, sort of warns you not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, because that will lead you astray. So there's this ambivalence about it, but it's sort of, so I don't want to deny it's dangerous, but not allowing it has a huge price, namely you suppress the individuality of people. So that is sort of so freedom is only true freedom for an individual in that tradition that thinks that individuality matters, can only be had if you do not deny it, marginalize it, oppress it, suppress it, devalue it, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, what might come out of this are sort of problematic desires, wishes, and blah blah blah. So that you feel is not something I would be good to act on, or something like that. So there is this real problem that we need it, but we need to be careful about it. And so that's, I think that's why it's so important. For instance, one of the things is that it stays on the level of not enactment immediately, but sort of on the level of expression. For instance, the example I gave about the relationship, you say people what your ideas about how that relationship could go, and why you care about it going in that direction. So that gives the other person an ability to respond, and it also is an ability, the position for them to sort of question your perception of the situation. And sort of people can point out to you different things, and that makes you reevaluate your own perspective, and sort of maybe it changes also how you emotionally respond to that scenario, now that you have a different perception of the situation, and so on and so forth. So it's not, the idea is not that you blindly act on it. Like you do not sort of typically blindly act on your moral judgment. You say that, I don't know, you think that something is morally problematic. And then another person wants to say, but wait, you haven't considered X, Y, Z, and you don't say, shut up, I don't care. I made my moral judgment. So you wait for whether there are other considerations you've missed, and that sort of it sort of, you have to turn this back, that self-reflective thing, into sort of a dialogical kind of relationship with others that is not dismissing them as equally important sensing and feeling beings, for instance, and imaginative beings. Sorry, way too long answer, Richard. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll have perhaps slightly briefer questions and slightly briefer answers. Peter, coming to you.
So I couldn't find my unmute button then. Okay, very, very quickly, many, many years ago, and oh my goodness, Jörg, I did my PhD back in 1996, so it's many, many years ago. I'm very glad you mentioned Schiller, by the way, because I was just going to mention him, but also Heine as well, who I think also is very much part of what you've mentioned. But there's a question I want to ask, and this relates, and oh my goodness, can I even mention a PhD this so many years ago? But this relates to a critique I did in my PhD about an educational philosopher called Michael Grimmett, who basically his issue, my issue with him was that he created an idea of what he called givens, G-I-V-E-N-S, givens that exist in our responses and in our interpretation of the world, which by implication he considered to be good, that we learn, we are able to learn, we have a capacity to learn, we have a capacity to know. You've used the word good, and I'm not trying to catch you out here, but you've used the word good many, many times in this. And I wondered if you might define what it is that is good as opposed to what isn't. And I'll leave it at that.
It could, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, even if though I said it a lot of times, I don't know exactly in relation to what I said. So that's why I struggle to give an answer, because I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
When
Well, I
said
mean, to help, I mean, I'm just sorry. I'm ever so sorry because I made something that just coming back to page where it is. Okay. So there is an intent I'm assuming a latent intent in people that we have a particular view of the world, and that by creating an imagination and by creating a new meaning, a constant new meaning, a constant self-becoming, that in itself is good. What is the good? I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I'm just saying, what is the good in that? Yeah.
But so I think the overarching good, yeah, that I'm concerned with, and sort of that links back to the very beginning of the talk, is freedom. Yeah. So what does it mean to live? So what is assumed is that it's good to live a free life. Yeah. And that would require some sense that you're not truncated, stinted, oppressed in any form or shape. Yeah, so that you realize yourself as a moral being, as a legal being, as like someone who contributes to productive cooperation. So there's all kinds of dimension to your, and the assumption is that is good. Yeah, freedom is good, and that it's also a good thing that freedom is viewed as being differentiated. So because even though that creates this kind of coordinations problems Ben and I talked about, yeah, so what if things point in different directions, and I think as a sensible being, yeah, what Schiller would probably call a sensible being, yeah, it is good for you to be allowed and encouraged to take how you see the world seriously. Yeah. So in a way, you feel if your perspective is marginalized or denied, yeah, that is something you will suffer from. If nobody cares about how you qualitatively or emotionally experience something, that is a very tricky thing to be in for a being of your kind. Yeah. And if other people's ideas about how the world should change on the basis of their perceptions and emotions matter, but yours don't, that is a form in which your freedom is denied in a very distinct kind of way. And sort of, if I say it's a good thing that we do that, I mean, it's a good thing that we encourage each other to be free. Yeah. And this is one way in which we should encourage each other to be free.
Can I just, again, just very quickly, when you say it's a good thing, yeah, I'm going to pin you down here. What is the actual, is this a universal good that exists before events take place, or is this a sociological thing? Is this something that is learned societally, as it were?
So yeah, I'm sort of, I should have presented my middle section. No, I'm talking all about like that means
maybe let's leave it and see what your middle section provides as an answer, and we'll come back later. I did say we come to Gail and then we'll move on into that middle section. So Gail, your question, please.
I think my question will probably sit with the middle section, having listened to the conversation. So
thank you very much for being willing to hold it, and maybe I'll give you the opportunity to come first after the middle section. Okay, Jörg, we're back with you then.
I feel like my middle section is not going to be terribly disappointing to everyone, but we'll see. It might not answer all the questions you have, but it's sort of,
don't talk it down yet. It's not good.
But the point is sort of, I think I'm really glad about the question you're raising, because sort of it makes me feel you're asking exactly the right kind of questions, sort of the ones I'm trying to ask myself. But I want to do in the middle section is take a step back for a moment, yeah. And sort of this is where I sort of give some kind of context in terms of the intellectual history of ideas. Yeah, and that is sort of when does this happen? Peter's question, sort of. So in a way, I think it's a feature of the fabric of our life. Yeah, that we think individuality, yeah, is something we value. Yeah, if you deny people's particularity, that there's something wrong with that. Yeah, and I think that's so much part of the fabric of our world, that we would always respond negatively when we feel like others do not feel any need to take the particularity of another person into consideration. Like if I have a student who comes to me and says, yeah, if I find your teaching style intimidating, and I would just shrug it off, yeah, I don't care. Like that's a form in which like people would be outraged, and they would be rightly outraged, because sort of there's a form of taking seriously the other person as an individual. And if this is their emotional response, I need to want to know, as someone who triggers it, sort of, what is it about my teaching style that makes it such that you have this kind of emotion? So we are living in a world, I think, in which individuality matters. Yeah. And as I said, I think we cannot have individuality. What discloses individuality? Yeah. What is sort of this exploration of sense perception, emotions, and the what I call the play of faculties. And I think there are two things I wanted to say about this is sort of, unlike all other dimensions of freedom, yeah, and this is sort of why I'm writing a book about this to some degree. Sort of, like all other dimensions, we do not really have a vocabulary to talk about that. Yeah, sort of, we know what it means to sort of violate someone's right. We know sort of roughly what it means to act immorally. But sort of there's this whole opaque thing about like imagination, sense perceptions, and emotions, and sort of that we don't really have a term for it. Yeah, so we don't really know what somebody's doing wrong when they're doing it wrong. So we can describe it. So we can say, yeah, I don't know. We can say things like, I'm just telling you how your behavior makes me feel, and you're not listening. Yeah, so sort of, or we're basically angry that somebody simply ignores how you perceive a situation, or your notions about how we could change things, or something like that. Yeah, so there are all kinds of these kind of things, but we really lack a vocabulary to talk about that. And because often, and this comes in the end, sort of, we cannot capture it with our normal moral language. We cannot capture it with our legal language, and then we sort of more prone to either ignore it or dismiss it. Yeah, so that the snowflake discourse is one of those. Yeah, it's like they just feel blah blah in a particular way, as if sort of how people feel is completely irrelevant. You know, like so there is this kind of element. Yeah, and so what I want to do in this book is sort of say that the birth of individuality, yeah, in the way we are experiencing, like in the way we are valuing it, even though we sort of lack a bit of vocabulary to talk about it, is sort of the 18th century. And it's linked with basically the birth of modern aesthetics. So that's the argument in my book, because in modern aesthetics, it's the first time where an argument is presented that you're not fully free unless you're free as a sensible being. Yeah, for instance, in Immanuel Kant, like that's just the generation before that. You have sort of, you're free to the extent that you determine yourself according to reasons that are generally acceptable, yeah, as a moral subject. But that doesn't even track your individuality. Yeah, your individuality comes in as the kind of empirical inclinations, and that's all sort of valueless stuff that makes you like another animal in a way. So it's only with Schiller, yeah, and modern aesthetic discourse that you have the first sense. You're only fully free when you're free as a rational and moral being and as a sensible being. And so that's in a way you could call it with Richard a re-evaluation of sensibility, and that takes place in 18th century aesthetic discourse. Yeah. So it's in this kind of aesthetic discourse I'm trying to argue in my book that the three capacities, sense perception, emotions, and imagination, are for the first time presented as valuable aspects of human personality. And before that, and it's the first time in modern aesthetic discourse that the exploration of these capacities is treated as something that is valuable in its own right. And sort of, I really want to basically highlight that there's a discursive shift, what we call it. Like these faculties, sort of up to this point, yeah, sense perception was merely treated as a tool, yeah. If you have a job interview and the person says, sit down here, and then basically just use your sense perception to find the chair, yeah. So it's a useful tool, but it's not something that is valuable in its own right. It's just instrumentally valuable. If you look at emotions, yeah, the way emotions figures in earlier rhetoric, yeah, is sort of understanding human emotions is important, but it's important because you want to be able to talk to people in a way that actually motivates them to do something. Yeah, it's sort of manipulative. Yeah, you want to be like a politician who needs to be a good rhetor so that he can actually get people to do something. Or if you look at it from the point of view of morality and religion, they were always highly suspicious of emotions, yeah, because emotions are the kind of thing that lead people away from doing what morality requires them to do, or basically fulfilling whatever your religion is, sort of the commandments that come with you and behavioral expectations that come with your religion. And sort of that's where the Bamidbar 15:39 comes in. Sort of don't follow your eyes and your heart, yeah, because that might lead you astray. Sort of you sort of stop focusing on the mitzvot that we all have to do, yeah, and sort of the and I think sort of since then, basically, you have this deep question we are talking about, yeah. We are really in a situation where we value individuality, and it's impossible for us to imagine, yeah, a world in which we are free. It has become impossible for us to imagine a world in which we are free, where how we see things, how we perceive things, how we emotionally respond to things, and how we imagine things has no value whatsoever. Yeah. And that's why, and I think that's sort of in a way one of the lessons of liberal Judaism, that it gives that it says that has to be incorporated in sort of Jewish practice, or it will be sort of, it will retain an element of oppression in it. Yeah. But having said that, yeah, that comes with the other problem that Ben talked about. Yeah, that it's an open question, I think, since the 18th century, whether that potential tension that can open up here, yeah, between what is morally required, what is required by your religion, and how you perceive, sense, qualitatively experience, and reimagine things, that threatens tradition, that threatens certain kind of practices that have sort of certain fixed boundaries and all kinds of things. So it's in a way, from the very beginning, the question of how do you square the circle, yeah, and the way I think Schiller thought about it, and I think that's also interesting in relation to Judaism, is sort of that you develop sensibilities. Yeah, human sensibilities are not just given, but you can also shape and cultivate human sensibilities such that you care about others, yeah, caring about others and things like that. So how we emotionally respond to situations is not something that is innate and fixed, but sort of that itself is something we acquire in a way with others, and sort of with the right kind of aesthetic education in the Schillerian term, yeah, it might be possible to sort of be morally free, rationally free, and sensibly free, but under, so at least it's sort of the Schillerian kind of thing, and so my suggestion is basically that I want to say, apart from moral freedom and legal freedom and political freedom and economic freedom, we need an account of aesthetic freedom. And by pointing to this aesthetic discourses of the 18th century that for the first time treated sense perception, emotions, and imagination as valuable dimensions of human personality, and says there is a value in allowing us and encouraging each other to exploring those. And that's another dimension of our freedom. So that's the end of part 2. I'm not quite sure if it answered any questions, and I will see whether it did answer Gail's question.
Thank you, Jörg. And I promised I would come to Gail, so let me do that now.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jörg. So I was quite right in keeping my question for the second part, because mine was touched very much on the social aspects, because for me, the whole talk is around becoming yourself and being yourself. And in that, there's something about conscience. You're not born with a conscience, you develop a conscience. And when we go back to the first part of your talk, you talked about friendship, and friendships and all relationships have to be built. And there are points in relationships where you can't tell the truth, or you feel you can't tell the truth because there are those subtle boundaries or barriers that are there. But that's not becoming yourself, because if it's rubbing against your beliefs, then that's not becoming yourself, and it's not being honest, and it's harboring a poor relationship. So I think my real question was around, in seeking Judaism, I found my conscience and my individuality through my development of my conscience, whether that's on a moral, not legal, I promise it's not been on a legal footing, but certainly from, I judge how would I feel if something was, if I did that to someone else. And I think the biggest question I always have is now, if someone says to me, why do you want to do that? I always say, why not? Because then you're taking on someone else's perspective. So I'm not really sure what the question was. I think the question would have been better.
I think you have a lot to pick from, sort of.
Thank you, Gail. And certainly conscience and its role is one aspect of your questioning. But Jörg, I'll leave you to decide what you felt needs picking up.
I think a lot of things that you mentioned deserve picking up, but I think that the part that sort of stuck out to me, what I noticed, is that there's also a liberation, that is being part of a community, and sort of being with others who are realizing something you think is valuable, and that can change sort of. So the interesting thing about, I don't know, again, Judaism, it's a practical kind of, it's a practical kind of entity that sort of guides attention in all kinds of ways and all kinds of contexts. So it's a form of shaping your sensibility too, and sort of. So I'm interested in sort of, when I'm interested in this idea that is already there in Schiller, that sort of self-becoming, being an individual, is impossible outside a community that is well organized, and sort of that allows you some freedom, but also.
Can you just say that one more time? Sorry,
I don't know exactly what I said. I have a horrible
self-becoming.
Yeah, sort of self-becoming, sort of. So basically in Schiller, it's not this sort of, you kind of think about self-becoming, even though it's sort of your perceptions that are at stake and your emotional responses that are at stake, as something that is sort of this individualistic kind of practice, So we all become selves in communities, And so that's why, and these communities shape our perceptions, the practices we engage in shape what we see, how we experience, how others relate to us, will transform how we qualitatively experience something, and so on and so forth. So I think what I found really interesting about Gail's comment is sort of that she found something liberating about becoming a practicing Jew in a Jewish community, and sort of that sounds counterintuitive if you think about this sort of this introspective dimension I talked about as something that you do as a detached individual, but you do that sort of in a way as part of different kind of communities, and these kinds of communities shape your perceptions and your qualitative responses and to certain things, and also sort of human beings sort of are these kinds of entities that, like, we do not have pure perceptions or raw perceptions. Yeah. So what you're seeing there is always conceptualized. Yeah. So when you give an account of what you're seeing, you use terms, and which terms you use will depend on sort of kind of what your outlook, yeah, or a practical outlook, and so on and so forth. So I think I'm basically, so what I found so interesting is that this in liberal Judaism, that it tries to square this circle practically as a communal practice, yeah, that you take the sensibilities of the individual seriously, but while involving them in a religious and moral practice in a way that shapes their perceptions and emotions to some degree. And so that's the hope that something like this is going to work.
But if I may,
yep,
what's happened personally for me is the experience and the development of my conscience, and me as an individual, it has been evidenced outside of the community as a result of being part of a community, if that makes sense. It's not about groupthink, it's about you developing as an individual and having that conscience.
But in the sense of sort of like, there's a question of sort of what does it mean you're like, I'm seriously asking, because that's a really interesting question. So what does it mean to be more aware of your conscience, yeah, or developing your conscience? So that's
it's more
being
about
more attentive to something that has always been
my personal moral compass, and that's what really brought me to the question around, you know, for me it's become much more around developing my conscience. So whether I'm at shul or doing something with the community, do I act differently than I would in a different environment? And absolutely not. And I think that's probably what attracted me and my husband, who's standing here, making up the numbers. Just, you know, because it is very much about your individuality, isn't it? Yes, you're part of a community, but there is an individual that makes up that community.
Thank you, Gail. Jörg, can I suggest we hear Tony's question? Give you a moment, and then I'm conscious that we're potentially running short of time. So after this further interaction, maybe we'll go into part 3. So Tony, a question, if you can keep it brief, that would be really helpful.
ELELS' golden rule was, what is hateful to yourself, do not do to your fellow man or fellow human being. But then he added on, now go and learn. So you had to. So he did say, do not do what's hateful, you know, outside other people. On the other hand, you've still got to learn. And the other thing I wanted to bring out was a guy called John Selden, who was locked in the tower for a while, and while he was there, he had nothing to do. So he learnt the Talmud, and he argued that the theory of motivation meant that natural law was revealed historically through scripture, and he influenced a whole load of Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke. Was it an Enlightenment project? The whole idea of individual, you know, in self-realization.
I think it is an Enlightenment idea, and sort of what I'm talking about, sort of, I think what you're more talking about is sort of moral self-realization, what it is to be a moral subject, yeah, and on what principles does a moral subject act, yeah. What I'm talking about is sort of the kind of thing that happened right after, yeah. Sort of when people thought about, okay, even if I'm an impeccable moral subject, yeah, in a way I would be just an exemplar of this, like I'm not myself in some senses, because I'm just a moral subject, and I would do what any other moral subject would do in that kind of situation. So I'm losing myself while realizing myself, and so this is the kind of thing Schiller responds to. Oh, sorry, I lost you. No.
I think
sorry, I'm back.
Good. I think we did get to the end of your statement, and then you realized that something was freezing, but the sound came through perfectly right until the end of your answer.
I just realized, and I should have gone to the extension of my Wi-Fi, which I never did, so it's unstable. I hope it carries us through the rest of this. Otherwise, I just try to reconnect with the other one.
We're doing okay.
Good.
Thank you, Gail and Tony. Let's move into part 3.
Good. I try to wrap this up quickly. It's actually something that you never get to the things you also wanted to equally focus on. So, and I wanted to now, like in the beginning, I talked about oppression, yeah, and I think there's a long history, yeah, that is very under-researched about the oppression of individuality, both in terms of individuals as in groups, yeah. And I think that's an additional dimension of oppression. We know what political oppression is, what sort of having sort of being not equal, like not having the same set of rights as other people. So that is all sort of very well researched, but there's also a dimension of oppression that sort of tackles the individuality. Yeah. And I think it's one, as I said before, I think there's a kind of muteness about this, that we don't know how to talk about this, yeah, so much, because it doesn't end up sort of in like the, I don't know, the suffragette movement in political rights. Yeah, you can show that now you have a passport and you can go to the voting booth or something like that. So there's a history of wronging others as sensing beings, yeah, where we should support them and sort of exploring the world with their senses. We sort of marginalize or suppress their perception. There's a history of wronging others as feeling beings, yeah, where we should support them in their emotional self-exploration. We sort of try to marginalize their expressions of how they feel about something. And there's a history of sort of that certain people's ideas or certain individuals' ideas about how the world should change in the light of their perceptions and qualitative experiences is less heard than those of others. Yeah. So I think there's a whole history of wronging that we do not really see as much as all the other forms of wronging. And I wanted to give some examples of this, maybe to end with, like, for instance, if you start to, like, because Tony talked about the Enlightenment, like with figures like Immanuel Kant and sort of his early aesthetic works on aesthetics, yeah, there are thoughts about, for instance, that non-whites do not have the complex emotional life as whites, yeah, or and that has a long trajectory. Like if you, I don't know, if I put on my medical ethics hat, yeah, it's still the case that for the same kind of fractures, Black people get prescribed less painkillers than whites. So you can see up to this day assumptions about emotionality in non-white groups, yeah, has a harmful effective history, yeah. Then sort of context basically dismisses the cultural productions of I don't know, of all kinds of cultures, yeah, on the basis he says, yeah, they have the ability to imagine, but for instance, the Arabs' imagination is inflamed, yeah, and those of the Indians, you know, that's why you have all these obscure kind of creatures. So that you basically diminish their capacities, yeah, in one way or another, and sort of that you have the same kind with regards to the working class, yeah, that they have coarse emotions and so on and so forth. So there's a long history that tracks mainly imagination and emotions in groups, and sort of I wanted to quickly talk a little bit more, give a couple of more examples that you know what I have in mind. So for instance, if you look at the 1960s and 70s feminist movement, yeah, consciousness raising in the writing groups, yeah, what that was, there were moral claims being made, legal claims being made, but what happened there too is that just women came together and basically spoke to each other in turns about what their life involves, how they perceive it in their own terms, not in the terms in which other people want them to see it, how they qualitatively experience, when they were always told that it doesn't matter how you feel as long as your husband is happy, you know, like this is exactly the kind of, like the emancipatory movements or dimensions of emancipatory movement that involve exactly these kinds of dimensions I've been talking about. So if you look at there's an explosion on feminist poetry, yeah, where all of a sudden all aspects of women's lives in the 60s and 70s were the first time people try to express in their own words what it is to live their lives and how they reimagine it. And sort of that's, I think, a very important thing. And sort of I was reminded of that, that's what I thought about in the beginning, is sort of when Richard wrote this email after the Sarah Everett killing, and you sort of reported the 25 things Hannah talked about. Yeah. So in a way, we wrong women all the time. Yeah. Some women are really unfortunate, and they're basically assaulted in ways that is tracked by violation of rights. Yeah. Some people have interactions that are morally problematic, but all women, yeah, live in fear before they go out and when they come home. Yeah. So basically we're imposing on them a kind of social order in which we think it's acceptable for, basically, as Hannah put it, everyone who doesn't look like a normal man, yeah, to use their sense perception, not in a way that you can sort of roam around with your eyes, see what fancy your interests, or look at the sky, but you look basically into shop windows to check whether people follow you. Yeah, they cannot freely use their sense perception. They can also don't have the leisure to simply think about what happened tonight, how does it make me feel, this conversation with my friend, but they're basically in fear of their life while walking home. And you can, and I think that's a form of wronging people that millions experience, that is completely ignored because there's no term for it. Like, because you could say, did somebody do something morally wrong to you? No, nobody followed me, nobody talked to me, nobody violated my right, but we continuously harm them aesthetically. And I think, so that's why this excavation is so important for me, because there are forms of wrongs for which we don't have words yet, and because we don't have real words for them yet. And sort of, but we have lists, you know, like the list Richard gave us, like with the 25 things every woman can come up with immediately from the top of their head, and we don't know, and we typically don't care. Yeah. And then the question is sort of, why is that? Yeah. And just to give you one more example, there's sort of, I've read this case about calls basically for safe spaces or only Black dorms in the US. Yeah. Black students wanted only Black dorms. Yeah. And then sort of you have these interviews with these people, why they want that. And they basically state that the non-white population on that campus doesn't give them a feeling they belong there. Yeah, that this is a place they should be. And then they asked, so why was that? And then one example that comes up over and over again is that sort of white students involved in conversation about affirmative action all the time, like basically admissions to college that sort of advantages people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Yeah, and clearly that's not a violation of anyone's right to raise that kind of issues. There's even an academically relevant issue. Yeah, it's for academic freedom. How do campuses select the people who get to study? Yeah, that's a pertinent question on a campus, and it's not immoral. It's actually a moral question you want to discuss. But the fact is, if it happens all the time, you get a sense of that for the non-Blacks, they question whether you deserve to be there. And you want one place where that is on campus, where that is not there. Yeah. So there's a sense, I think, for us to think, if it's not a moral issue and if it's not a legal issue, it's not an issue at all. And basically what you do when you say that, yeah, is saying that only rights and morality matter. Yeah. But one thing that you say in doing so, and I think that's the dangerous thing, is that what people perceive and feel and how they imagine the world to be otherwise in response to that doesn't matter at all. And that's a quite, like, it's a very dramatic thing to say. Yeah. Like there's a tendency to dismiss everything. For instance, another example was sort of the roads must fall in Oxford. Yeah. So how does it feel for certain groups if also Woodrow Wilson School of Government in Princeton, I think it was Princeton, the sort of students who basically, there's a sense in which they feel ignored, they're feeling being treated as irrelevant because basically slave owners, people who basically raped and tortured their ancestors, are still basically treated as names of honors and badges of honors in the community in which you're studying. And there's a form of dismissing that, because right now nobody's morally harmed, yeah, by that. And maybe you can treat with the harm by compensation. You don't have to change the name, or you can basically say there's no legal rights. Yeah, that's a freedom of speech, allows you to have statutes of all kinds of people there. But sort of what you do in the end is saying that the perceptions and feelings of certain people and their ideas about how their world could be changed so that they could feel more at home in it doesn't matter. And I think that is a sort of a very, I don't want to live in that world, yeah, where how people perceive and emotionally experience something, and how they imagine the world in the light of these kinds of negative experiences doesn't matter. And the other thing is the people who claim it's not a matter of morality and it's not a matter of law, therefore it doesn't count. These are the people who go on the barricades, yeah, when they say this new development destroys the perception of the village, yeah, the look of the village, yeah. So and sort of you would want to see them if they were to study in buildings where basically that carry the names of people who enslaved and tortured and raped their predecessors, whether they would still talk as if this is just feelings and they play no role. That's simply not the kind of human beings we are. Yeah, we are sensible beings and we respond to that, even if it's sort of hard to track it morally and legally. It's to dismiss it completely is, I think, something we shouldn't do. So like just with this sort of Sarah Everett comment and with these kinds of comment, I wanted to basically point us that there's forms in which we harm each other all the time, which goes in a way unnoticed because we have no vocabulary. And that's sort of the commentator in the newspaper type, yeah. I cannot see what the moral case for this is, nor can I see what the legal case for it is, ergo there cannot be a case because they ran out of the typical categories with which they assess these kinds of things. And I think that's the really dangerous and harmful situation in which we are, that perpetuates the marginalization of certain perspectives, emotional responses, and ideas for how our society should change.
Jörg, wow, you've given us a very powerful ending right there. We should be ending in 2 or 3 minutes. So if there are any final questions, we'll just try and keep them very brief. I was struck, we as rabbis were given a challenge a couple of years ago to look back on our high holiday sermons and see how many men we quoted and how many women we quoted. And generally speaking, far more men are being quoted than women. And I similarly wonder if some of the thinking in this field is influenced by the fact that, if you like, all the names we've discussed are European white men. And how much does that actually restrict the range and the diversity of thinking, perhaps? I'll come to Ben next, and then that might have to be it.
I think that's a very important question, sort of, and I have to say, like, I'm basically raised before sort of diversifying, decolonizing the curriculum took place. So I don't know what I'm missing. Yeah, so that's the sad truth of it. So I don't know. But what I basically do is, in a way, reading Hegel against Hegel. Yeah, so right now, sort of, I'm sort of, Hegel has no place for what I call aesthetic freedom in his account of ethical life or democratic life. Yeah, and sort of, I'm trying to sort of see how we have to reshape the architecture of relationships of freedom, if I can put it very abstractly, to sort of think as what dimensions of freedom must be considered in a society that is worthy of calling itself a form of free life. And sort of, there's this whole dimension of sense perceptions, emotions, and ideas for change that is not considered, and sort of, in a way, that is a way in for taking seriously people seeing things differently, experiencing things differently, and having very different ideas about where we could go from here. So I try to sort of, in a way, it lays sort of, it's a form of thinking our communal life that is open to being radically transformed from this point of view. While I think some people might think that that's still sort of the starting point is already parochial and so on and so forth. But I don't know how else to think is probably the honest answer right now. So that's how I'm thinking, and it's hard to think differently from how you're thinking.
Indeed. I share that sentiment entirely. Ben had his hand raised to raise a final question, and then I'm going to ask Ben to hand over to himself so that he can give a vote of thanks to you as we close our evening. Ben, final question.
Is that my question wasn't to Jörg, it was to Peter. I was
Even better.
But it's just that Peter was I've never seen someone listen to a talk so intently before, and I just had in mind that it was like someone judging someone on their viva. And I was going to ask Peter if you felt that Jörg had passed like your scrutiny.
Oh, I think I'll give him his PhD. No. Seriously, there were so many things, and you know, Jörg, I just found that so good. But there were so many things I wanted to sort of jump in and ask. Oh, hang on, what do you mean? Hang on. But I thought, no, I'm going to stay silent because I know Richard hates me when I do things like that.
That's not a good enough reason to stay silent. That's oppression, I think.
It's also not the end of time, so we will hopefully have other occasions.
But I was seriously impressed. So thank you. That really was a treat. Thank you.
Well, in fact, I've almost passed over to the vote of thanks to Peter as well. So Peter said what I was going to say. But as someone who, not quite as long ago as Peter, but someone who studied philosophy myself at university, my very first ever tutorial was on liberty and separating negative liberty and positive autonomy. Positive liberty and autonomy. I think you've brought that back. I again, like Peter, I thought I could have asked many other questions, but I didn't know if everyone was prepared to stay late enough for me to do it. I really found it interesting, and it's really I think from the examples that you gave at the end there, showing how resonant it is and how applicable it is to the world today, and maybe it's a change in the way in which we think about sort of judging the world and judging other people and rethinking morality and so on. So there's a lot of very fascinating and topical stuff there, and I'm sure that Peter and I, at least, and I'm sure many others will be picking your brains in times to come. But thank you very much for giving us the evening to give the talk to us, and for giving us all that stimulation.
Could we have a sequel?
I'm sure we can. So let me at this point invite everyone who wishes to unmute, and we'll see if we can give Jörg a Zoom round of applause for his erudition and explanations to us.
Thank you.
And to those who are streaming, I want to wish you all good night, and thank you very much for joining us. That concludes the evening. And for those on Zoom, you may get an opportunity to continue the discussion slightly